In 499 BC, when the Greeks of Asia asked Athens to join their rebellion against Persia, the assembly could spare exactly 20 warships, and Herodotus implies even that stretched the city. 20 years later, when the great king himself came for Greece, Athens launched 200. No Greek city had ever built a fleet that fast, and it was rowed by the poorest men in the city, laborers who could not afford a shield and spear. Those men pulled the oars at Salamis. They drove back the invasion, and then they came home to a democracy that had to reckon with them. This is the story of the trireme, the machine that made Athens a great power and welded her fleet to her democracy. We met Aristotle's rule in the hoplite episode. A state's constitution follows the military obligations of its citizens, and adopt the trireme, he said, and you get democracy outright. The Athenian navy is the test case, and it is more complicated than Aristotle allows. A trireme required at least 170 rowers, recruited from the citizen body. And they came generally from the poorest classes, men who could not equip themselves for hoplite service. At Athens, such men were classified as thetes, a category reaching back to Solon's reorganization of the constitution in 594 BC, long before any navy existed. For generations, they had served only as light infantry, and nobody took them seriously in the assembly. Then they became the rowers of the national fleet, and won a standing that let them assert their political rights. Navy and democracy advanced hand in hand. The word trireme is the Latin rendering of a Greek name. A warship driven by 3 banks of oars, 3 ascending tiers on each side, built for great speed. The culmination of shipbuilding craft reaching back into the late Bronze Age. And it was not born in Greece. The trireme evolved in the Near East, on the coast called the Levant, the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, running from Cilicia in southeastern Turkey down through Syria, along Phoenicia, modern Lebanon, to the ports the Romans would later call Palestine. Its people spoke Semitic languages, Phoenician, a form of Canaanite closely related to Hebrew, and Aramaic. In those harbors, above all Tyre and Sidon, with the Phoenician cities of Cyprus, came the breakthroughs in ship design that would produce the trireme. The world the trireme replaced is still visible to us. Shipwrecks found off the coast of Asia Minor and the ship frescoes of Sarah, the Aegean island whose volcano erupted catastrophically in the 16th century BC, show us early warships. From the late Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, roughly 1100 to 900 BC, a warship was essentially a converted cargo vessel, built to carry large numbers of men. Battle meant laying ships alongside, boarding, and fighting a land battle on a deck. And that made economic sense. A ship built to defeat a rival could, in peacetime, carry trade. The dual purpose suited the commercial cities of the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, and the Byblos, which wanted the ships they paid for to serve both war and commerce. At some point, ships split into 2 distinct types: the cargo vessel, the Greeks called it a holkos, and the dedicated warship built for combat and little else. Reliefs from Karatepe, a Neo-Hittite palace complex in southeastern Turkey, appear to show that separation already underway by the 8th or 7th century BC. The push did not come from the city-states. Phoenician and the Greek merchants preferred versatile ships that could double as traders. The Greek version was the Pentaconter, rowed by 50 oarsmen, 25 to a side. The drive came from the great monarchies of the Near East, first Assyria and then Persia. Kings wanted navies that could win decisive battles and enable conquest, and it was probably at their command that Phoenician shipwrights in the 7th and 6th centuries BC developed the techniques that produced the trireme, first built in the Phoenician ports. The Greeks adopted the new warship fast. By the time of Xerxes' invasion in 480 BC, the Phoenicians still ranked as the finest sailors and the most skilled tacticians afloat. The navy of Sidon was especially dreaded. but the tyrants of East Greece had long since answered. Polycrates, tyrant of the great trading island of Samos, and the Lygdamis, tyrant of Naxos, built what appear to be the earliest trireme fleets in the late 6th century BC. Their squadrons grew formidable enough to alarm the Peloponnesians. Sparta launched expeditions against both tyrants to break their naval power, one of the earliest instances of the Peloponnesian League deploying fleets. The trireme prevailed because Near Eastern monarchs had demanded it. They alone commanded resources on a scale no city-state could imagine. But once triremes were at sea, nobody could refuse them. The older Pentaconters could not compete, and the 6th century BC became a naval arms race, tactics shifting from boarding to ramming and sinking. By the century's end, the Greek city-states, the Phoenician cities, and the Carthage in the far west had all adopted the new warship. By 525 BC, anyone building warships anywhere in the Mediterranean built triremes. And by the Ionian Revolt of 499 to 494 BC, when the Greek cities of Asia Minor rose against their Persian overlord, every Greek city-state had converted. At the decisive Battle of Lade in 494 BC, 9 Ionian contingents together launched more than 350 ships. We know this machine intimately from paintings on Greek vases, from reliefs showing the 3 banks of oars, and from a full-scale reconstruction, the Olympias, built by the Greek government in the mid-1980s. Once her crews learned how to arrange the rowers across the 3 tiers and maneuver the ship, the sea trials were striking 9 to 10 knots under oar and half to 2/3 of that under sail. Yet the ships were remarkably unseaworthy, about 120 feet long and just 18 feet across at the widest point with a shallow draft. A trireme was a blade, not a boat. Triremes were beached every night, and whenever the crew needed a meal, the ancient sources say so, and the Olympias confirmed it. Cooking at sea is impossible. So the ships hugged the shore and threaded among the islands, putting in wherever they could for food and water, for they had little room to store provisions. The most fearsome passage in the Mediterranean was the crossing from northwestern Greece to the toe of Italy, which could leave a ship out of sight of land for a day or two. The Athenians made that crossing with entire military fleets bound for Sicily several times during the Peloponnesian War, most famously in 415 BC. In battle, a trireme carried its 170 rowers together with a small complement of fighters and specialists. Originally, there were about 20 marines, hoplites, and 4 archers, though the marines were later reduced to 10. Their role was to repel boarders, add the helmsman, the piper who set the stroke for the rowers, and various petty officers, and the total came to roughly 200 men. Under oar, those 200 could drive the ship at tremendous speed, in open water and confined water alike. 170 of those 200 men pulled an oar. Hold on to that number, it is about to reshape a city. Going into combat, the crew struck the sails and stowed them. Everything now depended on rowing, executed in perfect unison through careful drill. For the trireme's chief weapon was not its marines, it was the great bronze-sheathed ram mounted on the prow below the waterline. The object was to drive that ram into an enemy ship and destroy it. In practice, most stricken vessels did not sink outright. They settled as partly submerged wrecks, and every sea battle left wide fields of wreckage, with survivors clinging to the hulls. The aim was simply to put the enemy ship out of action. Doing it demanded timing, speed, and discipline of the very highest order. Ground warfare bred an art of maneuver. The Olympias trials showed that a trireme at full speed could turn through 180 degrees in about a minute. Charge in, strike an enemy on the broadside, and pull away. The Athenians became supremely skilled at exactly this. In Thucydides' accounts, they repeatedly defeat larger Peloponnesian contingents, above all in open water. Their favorite maneuver was the periplus, the sailing around, an elaborate contest of seamanship in which the fleet that could turn most sharply came up on its opponent's broadside and rammed. It was a duel of crews as much as of ships. There was a second technique, the diegplaus, the sailing through. Row hard at the enemy line, drive into the gap between two ships, and at the last moment draw in your own oars so that your hull shears the enemies away down one whole side, then come about and ram him in the stern, the most vulnerable part of a trireme. That maneuver was still in use in the Hellenistic age. Both moves demanded a crew that could outturn the man opposite. The less expert Peloponnesians answered differently, and in confined waters it worked. Heavier ships with reinforced prows, driven prow against prow, head-on. Those were the tactics of the great naval battles at Syracuse in 413 BC, the battles that ended Athenian sea power in Sicily. All of these demanded training and discipline far beyond anything the old converted warships had required, where battles were settled by boarding and fighting on deck. In the new navy, fighting on the deck of a trireme was a confession, a sign that a crew did not know its business. Thucydides makes the point more than once. Describing the sea battle at Sybota in 433 BC between the Corcyraeans and the Corinthians, he remarks that both fleets fought in the old style, decks crowded with hoplites and archers, ships locking together and holding fast. More a land battle than a sea fight, as men had fought in the distant past. It must have looked absurd to an Athenian commander expert in handling such squadrons, though some of that condescension, it must be said, is Thucydides' own. Fleets like this demanded a large citizen body. Only the biggest city-states could put to sea a substantial force of 30 or 50 triremes. Within the Peloponnesian League, that gave the naval allies real weight. Sicyon, Corinth, Aegina, and Megara could all build and maintain fleets, and contrary to common assumption, the Peloponnesians in 480 BC could launch at least 150 triremes. The Spartans themselves possessed a significant number, built by their perioikoi, the free dependents who were not full citizens. The Peloponnesian fleet was entirely respectable, and it had been patrolling Aegean waters for at least 2 generations. It was in fact older than the Athenian fleet, for the Athenians entered the naval business comparatively late. So Aristotle's rule that navies inevitably produce democracies does not fit Athens neatly. The Athenians achieved their democracy through political reform in 508 to 506 BC, when their navy was still rudimentary, small and probably composed largely of penteconters. Around 500 to 499 BC, asked to support the Ionian rebellion, Athens sent just 20 ships, and Herodotus implies that even 20 was a major commitment, only some 6 to 8 years after the democracy's founding. Yet by 480 BC, when Xerxes arrived, 20 ships had become 200. Some of the early ones were ordered from Corinth, which built ships for the young democracy during its war with Aegina, the island polis so close offshore that Pericles later called it the eyesore of the Piraeus. 2 developments above all built the fleet, and the first was a man. Themistocles rose in these years to dominate Athens. His one real failing, Thucydides concedes, was a venal streak, a fondness for money on the side. We have seen how he cleared his path. Through the 480s BC, he ostracized his rivals, Megacles, Xanthippus, the father of Pericles, Aristides called the just, men of the great houses that had ruled for generations. With the field clear, he saw the Persian threat early and set out to make Athens a naval power. He moved the naval base off the open beach at Phaleron onto the rock of the Piraeus, 3 deep basins that could be walled and defended. The arsenal at Zea, the harbor of Manicia, and the great commercial port. Athens was building not only a fleet, but somewhere to keep one. The second development, no one planned. In 483 to 482 BC, the Athenians struck an exceptionally rich vein of silver in the mines of Laurium, in the southeast of Attica near Cape Sunion, the site of the temple of Poseidon. The windfall was so large that the assembly proposed simply dividing it up, a bonus paid out to every citizen. Themistocles stood before them and persuaded them to spend it on the fleet instead, which was probably doubled to 200 triremes in the years just before Xerxes' invasion. And when the invasion finally came, and the Delphi was asked what would save Athens, the oracle answered that the city would be kept safe by a wall of wood. Themistocles told the assembly that God meant ships. The choice proved decisive. The silver under Attica became a wall of wood upon the sea. When Xerxes came in 480 BC, the Athenian fleet of 200 was joined by the 150 ships of the Peloponnesian League, and that combined force was what met the great king's navy in the straits. The naval war would prove the crucial factor against Xerxes. Athens' rise to sea power had come at an extraordinarily opportune moment. The city was newly democratic. It was led by Themistocles, one of the great democratic statesmen. It held the southern wealth of the silver strike, and it invested in triremes at the precise moment when lesser powers, above all in Ionia, could not keep pace, still rowing Pentecontes, priced out of the new arms race. Athens seized the lead easily in the 480s BC and turned herself into a major naval power. The consequences were profound. The navy had not created the Athenian democracy. The democracy already existed. Aristotle's principle that trireme warfare brings democracy worked at Athens not as a cause but as an accelerant. The fleet drove the democracy's evolution into a full participatory democracy, in which no restriction of poverty barred a citizen from office, from the council, from any public position. That is the very ideal Pericles voices in the funeral oration preserved in the second book of Thucydides. No man capable of serving the state is kept out of public life because he is poor. That a Thete, a laborer without land or armor, could aspire to high office was a direct outgrowth of the fleet. Feel the scale of it. At the time of the Peloponnesian War, Athens maintained 200 triremes in service and another 100 in dry dock. Rowing at the required standard demanded constant practice and the physique of an athlete. Scholars still debate exactly how the rowing was arranged on the benches. 200 ships, 170 oars apiece, manning the fleet took some 34,000 men, every one of them as fit as a rowing crew. A class this vital to the state's defense and this physically capable could not be excluded from political power, and the Athenian lower classes duly asserted themselves. By every estimate of Athenian demography, at least half the citizen population were thetes, men whose property fell below the 200 medimnoi threshold, who could not afford hoplite arms, let alone a place in the wealthy cavalry class. To other Greeks, and especially to the Peloponnesians who fought beside them in the coalition of 480 BC, the bearing of the Athenians came as a surprise. The Athenians stood apart. We can still hear how that fell to those who hated it. A pamphlet survives, The Constitution of the Athenians, anonymous, written in the 440s BC by an embittered conservative scholar called the Old Oligarch, who detested the democracy. He complains that thetes and even slaves behaved with insolence, that a man who shoved one aside in the street might find himself prosecuted, that aristocrats were forced to give way to their inferiors. His disgust is our evidence. The confidence Athenian citizens drew from their indispensable service in the fleet explains why, by the middle of the 5th century BC, the democracy had matured into a fully participatory system. Maintaining 200 triremes was enormously demanding, because a trireme was built less like a boat than like a piece of fine furniture. The ships were assembled by the shell-first method, every piece carefully fitted, nothing like the rougher clinker or skeleton building of the Middle Ages that made them extremely costly, and it required craftsmen of high skill. Below the waterline, the hulls were sheathed in lead to keep wood-boring sea creatures out of the timber, and every winter the ships had to be hauled out and serviced, which meant elaborate dry docks and large numbers of repairmen. The scholar Eugene Borsa has run the arithmetic. Between 483 and 410 BC, the Athenians may have built some 1,500 triremes, for ships destroyed in battle had constantly to be replaced, and a minimum of 10 new hulls were laid down each year. 1,500 ships means at least 300,000 oars. Attica itself could not possibly supply that much timber. It came from the north, from Macedon, and from Thrace, and it demanded pine as well as oak, especially for the oars and the spars. Athenian sea power, in other words, hung on a supply line to foreign forests. Shipbuilding became a highly specialized industry employing thousands, citizens and metics, resident aliens, free men from other Greek states who lived in Athens with a status akin to permanent residency, but were never granted citizenship. Citizens and the metics together filled the shipyards and all the supporting trades, the making of rope, the cutting of sails, the ceramics needed to fit out the ships. Within the early 5th century BC, Athens became a city built overwhelmingly on seaborne commerce and naval power, and a great many Athenians now drew their wages directly from service in the fleet. And the fleet paid well. Keeping one trireme at sea for a month cost roughly 1 talent, a talent being not a coin but a large measure of silver, equal to 6,000 drachmae. The drachma, the principal silver coin, weighed 4.35 grams, and it represented a generous day's wage. In much of the Greek world, even a third of a drachma was good pay for skilled labor. A Thete pulling an oar in the fleet earned about a drachma a day, as much as a hoplite. Pay like that bound great numbers of Athenians materially and permanently to the navy. And so the navy became, in many respects, the very definition of the Athenian democracy. The men who served in the fleet would always support the democracy, and the assembly those men filled would always vote to build more ships. It is a self-reinforcing loop, and history has seen it since. The British parliamentary system rested on its navy in just this way, from the late 17th century into the early 20th, with much the same political, social, and economic consequences. In all of Mediterranean history, only one other city-state ever held comparable primacy at sea, Venice, in the late Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. In 480 BC, as Xerxes invaded, Athens stood on the threshold of becoming the Mediterranean's first great naval power. Victory over Xerxes would carry her further still, to an imperial position that would awe Sparta and her Peloponnesian allies, for the trireme was never merely a machine of war. It was the hinge on which Athenian power and Athenian democracy turned together, binding the poorest citizen to the fate of the state and the state to the sea. 200 ships, 34,000 rowers, one city wedded to the water that carried it. As the great king's fleet bore down on Greece, the wooden walls of Athens stood ready. What they did in the Straits of Salamis is the next chapter, and it is the victory that turns this city into an empire.